So what I'd like to talk about is basically give an illustration about the semantic enterprise and also the kind of reasoning we do and the kind of evidence we draw from and the kind of modeling. So that's sort of the basic enterprise. If you do formal semantics, you look for building blocks. So you do not just look at what the construction as a whole, what it means, but you want to explain in how it is composed, what the components are that lead to the ultimate judgment that you come up with. And so here is a quote, and this time is from a phonologist, from somebody in a very different discipline. So linguists are always looking for new tests that can definitely identify the fundamental building blocks of language. And I'd like to engage in a search of this kind with respect to attitude descriptions, belief descriptions, knowledge descriptions, whatsoever, and sort of see what are the building blocks, what goes into those descriptions. So these are the questions. What are the conceptual building blocks for constructing attitude reports and descriptions? And what we eventually want is we want to come up with the combinatorics to understand how the building blocks, once we have identified them, how they combine to give us a typology that is a range of, give us an estimate of the range of variation that we find in the way these constructions are made in languages that could be quite diverse. So this is the traditional story about attitude descriptions. What you basically have here, you have a verb, an attitude verb, that's the verb know in this case. And basically, if you understand know, you understand the construction as a whole. What know does, it describes a particular state, a mental state, a state of knowledge. And the way we think about meanings, it also tells us something about the arguments it has. So it has a propositional argument that gives us the content of the attitude, and it has an individual argument that gives us the argument whole. So that's the traditional story, and there isn't really much to build with that story, because once you have the verb, you have the rest. There's no typology that is generated. There's no combinatorics that may help us understand how these constructions may be built in slightly different ways across languages. And so the question is, say, if you think about acquisition, it feels as if there's really nothing much to master. Once you have mastered the verb, you have mastered it all. So I'd like to draw attention here to some overlooked or neglected building blocks. And these are elements that appear in the embedded clause. They do not come from the embedded verb, they come from the embedded clause. And so these are various moods or modal elements that appear in the sentential complements of attitude descriptions. I give you an example from Navajo, Native American language, and this work comes from a dissertation by Elizabeth Bogle Albritton, fieldwork, carefully done fieldwork-based dissertation. And here are some examples. So the first sentence roughly translates into English as I think it is probably raining. The second one translates as I wish that it were raining. So what is interesting about this is that in each case, the embedding verb, and this is the rightmost element here, the embedding verb is the very same in both of those cases. So you have listen in both of those cases. What makes one of the cases a belief description and the other one a desire description is a modal element in the embedding clause. These modal elements, when they occur in matrix clauses, when they occur unembedded, they have the expected interpretation. So in one case, we have an epistemic modal. Maybe we talk about subjective probability in this case. In the other case, you have something like a douletic modal. when they appear in the embedded clause with the very same embedding verb, they give us a belief description in one case and a desire description in the other. And so that is a case we theoretically have to reckon with. We have to sort of understand, in those cases, how come a language can use this very different technology to arrive at the very same result that we do in English by just having particular types of embedding verbs. The next exhibit, if you will, comes from German, which is my native language. And what we see there is that with one and the same embedded verb, it may depend on the mood of the embedded clause whether the whole construction is factive or not. And when I use factive here, I use it, I'm not interested in presuppositions, so I'm not interested in whether an inference the inference to the truth of the embedded clause, whether that's a presupposition or a mere inference, is really, I'm interested whether we really infer the truth of the sentential complement to begin with. And in German, in certain cases, whether we draw the inference or whether we don't depends on the mood in the embedded clause. And so we have here something, remember, is the verb, erinnern Sie sich, dass weinte. She remembered that he was crying. We usually infer that indeed she was crying. Not so if, also that's actually on the next slide, not so if we use a subjunctive in the embedded clause, in this case called Konjunktiv 1. So we have something like Sie erinnerte sich, dass geweint habe. So we no longer infer the truth of the sentential complement. In this case, the sentence is typically interpreted as a speech report. And what makes it a speech report does not come from the embedding verb, it comes from the embedded clause. And the second example is similar. Verliebt, dass krank war, he disclosed that he was sick, is usually interpreted as factive. Usually we do infer from that sentence that he was sick. Not so if the mood in the embedded clause is a subjunctive. Verliebt, dass krank sei, we no longer infer that he was sick. Again, the construction as a whole is typically interpreted as a speech report. So what I conclude from that on methodological grounds is that our semantic theories that tell us how the meanings of complex sentences are constructed from the meanings of their part, they have to allow for the possibility that crucial properties that we tend to ascribe to the embedding verb based on languages like English may in fact come from the embedding clause. So we have to have it. So the third exhibit has to do with what I like to call a different construction principle. That is, we tend to think like the traditional analysis of a verb like know or a verb like believe tells us that the proposition that the embedded sentence is an argument. It functions as an argument. Once we look at a wider range of constructions, even within English, we sort of see that maybe that's not true. So we have to look for a different way of associating that clause with these verbs. And so here are some of the examples. We have something like the idea that Orkan is a spy baffles me, or the myth, or the story, or the evidence that Orkan is a spy baffles me. In this case, it does not look like that clause functions as an argument of the noun, because these are all nouns that have been cleverly chosen in such a way that they do not seem to take arguments. So the function of the that clause in those cases seems to be the function of a modifier. If we are talking about the story, or the idea that Orkut is a spy, or the myth that Orkut is a spy, we're talking about a myth. And we're ascribing a particular property to that myth, namely that it has the content that Orkut is a spy. And so in those cases, it looks like the that clause does not function like an argument. The that clause functions as a modifier. Enogabo, who works on West African languages like Umbe, has argued, and you can see this in some of the languages that he investigates very explicitly, that this noun modification function of that clause is still pretty overt. And so that means that this modification possibility is also a theoretical possibility that we have to reckon with when we construct our theories. So in the best of all possible cases, we would come up with an analysis, even for English, that somehow accommodates the full variety of ways of building an attitude report that we find in various languages. So the hunch here is my that clause generally denote properties. That is, maybe once we have figured out what a that clause does when it modifies a noun, we can, this very same technology will also work in cases where a that clause looks as if it is an argument of a verb. What is that time?
You have 7.5 minutes.
Oh, so that is it. Okay, so here I just want to give you a glimpse into what a technology here may look like. This is very, very simplified, so it's this 5-minute version, just to see a proof of concept that it's possible to construct attitude descriptions in such a way that not just English or German, but various other languages that seem to be quite different at the surface can be accommodated. Okay, so one possibility is that we think of the embedding verb in neo-Davidsonian ways. That is, they would just describe eventualities, or meaning events proper or states. So no, rather than being a verb that determines particular arguments that it takes, no now would just be a predicate of states, for example. Similar with think, believe, say would be, actually that should be, should have written be, say would be a property of events. Then we could have a very general predicate that is just true of a state if it's a mental state. Okay, so this would be the upstairs part. So if we have, Rolf knows that Orkut is a spy, so we have the upstairs verb would just be represented as a property of states. It's true of a state if it's a mental state of a computer. Now we have to sort of think about the that clause and how to bring those two pieces together. And the proposal here is that the that clause also expresses a property of eventualities that is a property of states or a property of events. And so here, this would be the blueprint generally for moods or modals. So we have, these are expressions that take a propositional argument. So this is here, the propositional argument. And once they have saturated that type of argument, they describe a property of eventualities as well. So that would be a property of states or a property of events. And so if the upstairs verb describes a property of events, the downstairs that clause describes a property of events, we can conjoin these two predicates, identify the events, and so we get a property of events or a property of states that have the property expressed by the that clause. And so that would be, for example, a property of having a particular propositional content. So that would be the mode composition. So here, the way I wrote this formula is here. So we have a propositional argument, also called the adjacent. Once that's saturated, we get a property of states. And so here we have a condition placed on those states, namely that in all worlds that are in the set of worlds projected from that state, P, the proposition P, is true. The mystery part here is F. That is a free variable. And it's a free variable for domain projection functions. So the idea is if we have an event or a state, say a mental state, then this mental state may determine a range of possibilities, a range of possible worlds. For example, the set of all possible worlds that are compatible with the content of the state, if it's a state that has propositional content to begin with. And so we can consider, we can imagine a whole range of various types of domain projection functions that come with various types of modal expressions. And so a billectic modal, like should, would come with a different domain projection function than an epistemic modal like must, or a deontic modal, etc. So the idea is that modals come with distinctive domain projection functions, and in this case, the domain projection function is determined by an eventuality, like a mental state or something else. So that is the idea here. Here we have the composition. I already talked about how the composition would work. In this case, we have two properties of states, and the composition simply consists in predicate conjunction. We're conjoining these two states. That is, both parts here of the computation help with determining the kind of mental state that we are describing in the end. And so that means that conditions on the state that we are describing could come from upstairs, they could come from a verb, if the verb is specific enough, but they could also come from downstairs. And so this is a way of accommodating languages like English on the one hand, and languages like Tamil on the other. Okay, so the idea for projecting modal domains from eventualities has been elaborated in most detail by Valentina Tag in her dissertation, and this is something I've relied on here. The next slides, I just want to illustrate a little bit how those domain projection functions, how they function in just with normal modal verbs. With verbs that are not necessarily adjective verbs. So we have here something like a Yeti must have walked by. We have an epistemic modal. I gave you a situation here where this is a possible utterance. And so what we're talking here, we have a particular state of the world. This is not a mental state, it's just a particular state of the world where there are tracks in the snow. And what we're saying is that in all worlds compatible with that evidence, there are tracks a Yeti walked by. So the tracks in the snow are evidence for another fact, namely a fact consisting in a Yeti's walking by. One way of modeling this would be to say, well, in this case, factual domain projection, what it does is it takes a part of the world, it takes an event, it takes a state, and it gives us a set of possible worlds that have counterparts of that state or that event. That gives us a very wide modal domain, too wide But we do know that these modal domains are, by default, further constrained. They're sort of cut down by all kinds of normalcy conditions, including no effects, if you will. So these do not only have to be factual constraints, all kinds of other constraints that the language does not encode explicitly. They come from outside. Then we may have content-related domain projection. Already talked about this. So here we may project a modal domain, say from something, a mental state, an utterance, something that has intentional content. We are looking now at the set of possible worlds that conform, that are compatible with that content. We may also then go on and look at other ways of domain projections. Some eventualities determine norms, like an offer, a promise determines particular norms. And so we may look at possibly ordered sets of possible worlds that comply with those norms. So the upshot then is that in general, we would build an attitude ascription by taking a verb that merely describes an eventuality, and we would compose it with a that clause that has a free parameter where different kinds of domain projection functions can be plugged in. So that creates a combinatoric. Where you can combine any kind of verb you like with any kind of sentential complement you like, with whatever domain projection function plugged in that you like, as long as the semantic composition is defined and gives you a reasonable result. Here the prediction would be this is a possible construction. So here's the content plan. Now this overgenerates. This gives us way more than what we actually observed. And that gets me to the conclusion of that talk, is how to tame the overgeneration. And maybe that sort of relates what I have to say to what the earlier speakers said. There are various ways of taming overgeneration. The traditional linguistic method, say what I was trained in, would be now to sit down and look for grammatical constraints that may cut down the overgeneration. In the meantime, there are other possibilities that we should be very open-minded about. There could be preferences. There could be violable constraints. And so there could also be merely probabilistic constraints that we should consider. And so that's the